At a table full of people, a man can be lonelier than a castaway on an empty island. Look at almost any family dinner tonight. The bodies are seated side by side, the plates are steaming, someone is telling a story. And underneath the table, 6 hands are holding 6 screens. 6 attentions have already left for somewhere else. No one has left the room, but no one is fully in it anymore. Long before there was a notification to distract us, this condition already existed. Presence without presence. The phone did not invent loneliness. It simply found a heart that already knew how to run from itself and handed it a more efficient tool for doing so. And that is where the question no one can quite answer begins. Why do we feel so dramatically alone in a world where we are connected 24 hours a day? We have more friends on a screen than any generation in history ever had in the flesh. And yet, the waiting rooms of psychologists are full of people describing the same symptom in different words. An emptiness that no message ever fills. In the middle of the 20th century, a Catholic bishop sat down in front of a television camera at a time when the medium still frightened most clergymen and began speaking about the human mind the way one speaks about a poorly kept house. He did not reach for the word psychology to impress anyone. He used it because he knew the subject from the inside, not only from books, but from the thousands of people who had sat across from him in the confessional and outside of it, telling him the same story. I am surrounded by people and I have never felt so alone. One of those confessions stayed with him. A man who lived surrounded by appointments, parties, and acquaintances, who admitted that he had not spent, in years, a single full hour alone with his own thoughts without turning on a radio, calling someone, or inventing a task. His thesis was simple and uncomfortable. Loneliness is not born from the absence of people around us. It is born from the absence of a purpose large enough to outweigh the next distraction. And man flees from himself, always, for the same reason. He is afraid of what he will find once the noise stops. In that moment, the bishop recognized something the psychology of his day was still struggling to name. The flight from oneself is the most common and the most hidden symptom of the modern soul. Notice the most common and most overlooked habit of our time. No one waits anymore. No one waits for the elevator without opening a screen. No one stands in a bank line without scrolling a feed. No one stays still for 10 seconds in absolute silence without feeling an itch in the hand reaching for a pocket. This is not a technology addiction. It is a fear of emptiness. And the emptiness in question here is not an empty calendar. It is the emptiness of being left alone with oneself. An entire generation has learned to avoid 2 seconds of silence, the way one avoids the edge of a cliff. The reason is simple to name and hard to admit. In silence, the thoughts we spend the day sweeping under the rug finally rise to the surface. The doubt about our own worth, the old wound that was never resolved, the question of where life is actually going. All of it lives exactly in the place we run from with a screen. The result is a quiet, vicious cycle. We isolate ourselves from our own interior life, and that isolation produces anxiety, because a soul that does not know itself lives in permanent alarm, without knowing what it is defending against. And that anxiety, in turn, pushes a man back toward more distraction, more noise, more scrolling, in an attempt to numb his own discomfort. The more he runs, the more anxious he becomes. The more anxious he becomes, the more he runs. Notice that this was never really about technology. Television did this in the 1950s. Radio did it before television. The addiction is not in the device. It is in the inability to inhabit one's own silence without panic. Every generation trades one instrument for another, but the gesture is always the same, running outside of oneself. And the cruelest part is that this flight can wear the mask of a full social life. A man may have 500 contacts, 3 active group chats, a calendar packed with engagements, and still not have had, in years, a single honest conversation with himself. He mistakes being surrounded for being accompanied. They are not the same thing. The question left hanging at the end of this portrait is not, how do I fill my calendar with more people? It is a harder one. What exactly are we avoiding when we avoid being alone? There is an answer to that, and it did not come from a productivity manual or a wellness app. Few observers of the human soul in the 20th century had a laboratory as large as this bishop's. He did not write about the mind from a theory built at a desk. He wrote after decades of hearing, in the confessional, the unedited version of people's lives, the version they never told even their closest friends. And what he noticed year after year was a pattern the psychology of his time insisted on treating as a social problem, but which he recognized as a spiritual one. The person who complained most of loneliness was almost never the person who was most physically isolated. Often it was the busiest, the most surrounded, the most connected person by the standards of the day. That observation led to a distinction that would become central to his thought, and one he develops with precision in Peace of Soul. The difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the forced absence of company, a state a person suffers and wants to escape. Solitude is something else entirely. It is the capacity to be alone with oneself and with God without needing to flee that encounter. A person can live in isolation and never once have tasted solitude. And a person can live surrounded by people while remaining, at the same time, spiritually unable to bear a single minute alone. This distinction was not wordplay. It was a diagnosis. Because, for this bishop, modern man did not suffer from too much loneliness. He suffered from an inability to enter solitude. He confused the two constantly, and so he kept treating the wrong symptom, trying to feed a starving soul by filling the calendar with people, when the problem had never been a shortage of company. And here is the detail no one expects to hear from a bishop in the 1950s, decades before a single phone notification existed. He had already identified that the engine behind this flight was not a lack of free time. It was fear. Fear of discovering, in the silence, that the life one is living does not carry the weight one would like it to carry. According to him, most people who claim to hate being alone do not actually hate solitude itself. They hate the company they find when they are alone, themselves. If that is true, then the problem was never the absence of people nearby. The problem is indoors, inside one's own head, and that is exactly where the explanation gets harder and more revealing. Why then is it so difficult simply to decide to sit in silence and settle the matter alone? Because the mechanism behind the flight is not a conscious choice. It is a trained reflex, repeated thousands of times until it becomes automatic. Consider it this way. Every time silence begins to bring an uncomfortable thought to the surface, and a person reaches for the phone, or turns on the television, or invents some errand, they receive immediate relief. The discomfort stops, and the mind learns without anyone teaching it directly that fleeing works. With each repetition, that path becomes easier to walk, while the other path, staying and moving through the discomfort, becomes stranger, more avoided, almost forgotten. The result, decades later, is a grown adult who has never learned how to be alone with himself without panicking. Not for lack of intelligence or will, but because no one ever showed him that there is something on the other side of silence besides the emptiness he fears finding there. And here lies the most common misdiagnosis of our time. We treat this symptom as though it were purely behavioral. Disconnect more, use your phone less, get out of the house. But these remedies only touch the surface. This bishop insisted that the emptiness felt in loneliness is not solved by filling the time, it is solved by filling the purpose. A soul without a transcendent reason for being will keep fleeing from itself even with no phone anywhere nearby. It will simply find another escape, always. This is why so many attempts at a digital detox fail. A person turns off the phone for a weekend, feels the old discomfort return in full force, and concludes that silence just doesn't work for them, when in truth, they only grazed the wound they had been avoiding for years and pulled back at first contact. The full diagnosis then has two layers. The first is habit, decades of a trained reflex pushing a person outward the moment silence tightens its grip. The second, deeper layer is absence, an emptiness that no amount of company, tasks, or scrolling can fill, because it was made to be filled by something else. As the bishop himself wrote, still in Peace of Soul, the human heart has a particular shape, and only something larger than itself can fit inside it. This means the way out is not simply be quieter, it is to step deliberately into the very silence one has been avoiding, but to step in accompanied. Because only then does that silence stop being a cliff's edge and become a door. This bishop's answer to that impasse had a simple, almost domestic name: the secret room. The idea is direct. Everyone has already experienced forced solitude, a wait, an evening with no plans, a walk alone. What he proposed was not to eliminate these moments, but to transform their meaning, to take the solitude life forces upon us and deliberately choose to use it for self-examination, not as punishment, as an appointment kept. On the blackboard, he liked to draw this idea as a simple division. On one side, the surface ego, the version of us that exists for others, that answers messages, that keeps up appearances, that is always online, even while exhausted underneath. On the other side, the real soul, hungry, silent, waiting for years for a single minute of attention that never came. The first practical step in his teaching is simply to admit that these two are not the same person, and that most of our day is spent in service of the first, while the second withers unnoticed. The second step is to actually set aside a short daily time, it need not be a full hour to begin, in which no screen, no errand, and no conversation is permitted to enter. This is not an empty meditation in the sense of emptying the mind and waiting for nothing. It is the opposite. It is deliberately filling that time with an honest question addressed to oneself and to God about what is truly happening inside. The difference between loneliness and solitude is not measured by the clock. It is measured by who is invited into that silence. The third step is resisting the first impulse to flee, which always appears in the opening minutes. This bishop warned that this is precisely the most dangerous and most decisive moment, the instant when the old habit shouts loudest for any distraction within reach. Getting through those first few minutes without giving in is what separates the one who finally enters his own secret room from the one who spends a lifetime only circling its door. And the fourth step, perhaps the most decisive of all, is not to leave that time empty of content. The mistake most people make when trying to disconnect is sitting alone with themselves without inviting anyone else into that room. And solitude without God tends to curdle quickly into despair, not peace. That is why the secret room, in its original form, is never an exercise in pure introspection. It is a meeting between two, the soul and its maker, in the same space, in the same silence. What is gained from this is not a passing sensation of calm. It is a change in one's very relationship with silence. A person who moves through this practice again and again stops fearing the empty moments of the day, the wait, the free evening, the solitary walk, because nothing threatening remains hidden inside them anymore. What was once emptiness to be avoided becomes space to be inhabited. The entire architecture of modern loneliness comes down to a wrong address. We look for the cure out there, one more contact, one more notification, one more companion, when the wound has always lived somewhere none of that can reach. It is not the lack of people around us that hollows us out. It is the lack of someone or someone with us in the silence. The question that remains then is not abstract. Why are you so afraid of 5 minutes alone with no screen, no sound, no errand to hide behind? And the everyday version of the same question is even more direct. The next time you are standing in line, in an elevator, in bed before falling asleep, and your hand reaches automatically for the phone, what exactly are you trying not to feel in that instant? You will only be afraid of being alone if you do not like the person you're locked in the room with. And the good news is that this person can change, not by pretending to be someone else, but by discovering in that very silence you avoid today that you were never, in fact, alone in there. If you want to learn more about how Fulton Sheen faced the very questions we live with today, watch one of the next videos, like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you enjoyed most. Every week, we bring you more episodes that will help you understand why your life is worth living. And perhaps you'll come to see that each video is not just an explanation. Perhaps it's an invitation.